The stagecoach wheels churned the red dust of the territory into a suffocating cloud that hung suspended in the stagnant summer air, marking the only movement in a landscape defined by its crushing stillness. May stood beside her single battered trunk, the silk of her high-collared tunic clinging uncomfortably to her skin in the oppressive heat, watching the vehicle lurch away until it was nothing more than a dark insect crawling toward the horizon. She was entirely alone in a world that felt vast enough to swallow her whole without leaving a trace. The silence of the plains was not peaceful. It was a heavy, predatory weight that pressed against her eardrums, broken only by the dry hiss of wind moving through the endless sea of sagebrush and wild rye. She gripped her hands together, feeling the dampness of her palms, her knuckles white as bone, terrified to look behind her where the man was waiting. She had traveled across an ocean that smelled of salt and sickness, then across a continent of iron rails and smoke, only to be deposited here, at the edge of the earth, sold effectively into a life she could not imagine. When she finally turned, dragging her gaze upward from the cracked earth, he was there. Julian stood near the hitching post, his silhouette cut sharply against the blinding white of the midday sky, a figure carved from the same rough granite and timber that defined this unforgiving frontier. He was taller than any man she had ever seen, his shoulders broad enough to carry the weight of the sky, clad in a dust-coated coat that had seen too many seasons. He did not move toward her immediately, nor did he smile. His face was a map of the land itself, weathered and lined, his eyes shadowed beneath the brim of a worn hat, dark and unreadable. To May he looked like a storm that had not yet broken, a vessel of contained violence, or perhaps infinite sorrow. She could not tell the difference. She felt a tremble start in her knees, a physical manifestation of the terror that had been a cold stone in her stomach for weeks. She expected him to inspect her, to look at her as the broker in San Francisco had, like livestock to be assessed for teeth and endurance. But Julian simply watched her, his gaze steady and oddly devoid of greed. He took a step forward, the sound of his boots heavy on the packed dirt, and the sound echoed like a gunshot in the quiet. He reached for her trunk, his hand large and scarred, easily lifting a weight that she had struggled to drag inches. "The wagon is this way," Julian said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to vibrate in the air between them, gravelly and deep, unused to speaking. He did not wait for a response, perhaps knowing she had none to give, or perhaps understanding that words were useless currency in this place. May followed him, her small steps struggling to keep pace with his long stride, her breath catching in her throat as the heat radiated off the ground in shimmering waves. The town behind them was nothing more than a collection of false fronts and desperate ambition, but they were leaving even that small comfort behind. As she climbed onto the wooden seat of the wagon, clutching the iron rail until the metal bit into her skin, she felt the finality of the moment crashing down on her. There was no ocean here to carry her back, no rail line to offer escape. There was only the man, the horses stamping impatiently in the dust, and the terrifying, beautiful expanse of the American West stretching out into eternity. The journey to the ranch was a passage through a landscape that seemed to mock the fragility of human emotion, the vastness of the prairie reducing their silence to something insignificant and small. Julian drove the team of horses with an effortless, practiced competency, his hands loose on the leather reins, yet clearly commanding the powerful animals with subtle shifts of his wrists. For miles there was no sound but the rhythmic clop of hooves, the creak of wood straining against iron, and the relentless dry wind that whipped stray strands of May's dark hair across her face. She sat rigid, her spine straight, refusing to lean back, refusing to show the exhaustion that pulled at her eyelids. She stared out at the wildflowers that dotted the plains, bursts of Indian paintbrush and bluebonnets that had survived the early heat, but their beauty was lost on her, blurred by the moisture gathering in her eyes. Every jolt of the wagon sent a fresh wave of panic through her chest, a reminder that she was being taken further into isolation, away from anyone who might speak her language or understand her customs. May stole a glance at Julian, studying his profile against the glare of the sun. He looked straight ahead, his jaw set in a line of stoic determination, his eyes scanning the horizon with the vigilance of a hawk. He did not look like a cruel man, but cruelty often wore the mask of indifference until it was too late. She wondered what he wanted from her, what duties he expected her to perform to earn the shelter he was providing. The broker had spoken of a wife, but in May's experience, wives were often little more than servants with different titles. She felt the tears she had been holding back begin to spill over, hot and humiliating, tracking through the dust on her cheeks. She turned her head sharply away, staring into the endless grass, ashamed of her weakness. She bit the inside of her lip until she tasted the metallic tang of blood, willing herself to stop, but the grief was a dam breaking, a physical pain that racked her shoulders. Julian did not speak, but the rhythm of the wagon slowed imperceptibly. He did not turn to look at her, granting her the dignity of her privacy, yet the air in the wagon shifted. He shifted the reins to one hand and reached into his coat pocket, pulling out a clean, albeit wrinkled, handkerchief. Without a word, he placed it on the wooden bench between them, a silent offering of white cloth against the scarred wood. It was a small gesture, almost insignificant, but in the vast emptiness of the territory, it felt enormous. May stared at the cloth, her heart hammering against her ribs. She did not take it immediately, afraid that accepting his kindness would create a debt she could not pay. But as the wind dried the tears on her face, leaving her skin tight and salty, she realized that his gaze remained fixed on the road, demanding nothing. He was simply offering a tool for the sorrow, acknowledging her pain without trying to own it. Slowly, with a trembling hand, she reached out and took the handkerchief, clutching it tightly in her fist as the wagon rolled on under the burning sun. The ranch house emerged from the landscape not as an intrusion, but as an organic extension of the earth itself, built of timber that had weathered to a silver gray that matched the trunks of the cottonwood trees guarding the creek. It was a solitary structure, sturdy and unpretentious, sitting in the shadow of a rising bluff that protected it from the harshest winds. When Julian brought the wagon to a halt in front of the porch, the silence that fell was sudden and absolute, broken only by the settling of the leather harness and the distant call of a meadowlark. May remained frozen on the seat, her knuckles white as she gripped the fabric of her skirt. This was the threshold. This was the moment her life truly became someone else's property. Julian stepped down, his boots crunching on the gravel, and walked around to her side. He did not grab her or pull her. He simply offered a hand, palm up, waiting. It was a calloused hand, stained with the work of the ranch, but it was held steady. May took it, her fingers small and pale against his, and allowed him to help her down. Her legs felt weak, the ground swaying beneath her as if she were still at sea. She followed him up the wooden steps, the boards groaning softly under their weight, and into the main room of the house. It was cooler inside, the air smelling of pine pitch, wood smoke, and old leather. The room was sparse, containing only the necessities of life, a heavy table, a few chairs, a cast-iron stove that dominated one wall, but it was clean, meticulously swept, with a kind of masculine order that spoke of a disciplined mind. May stood in the center of the room, clutching her small bundle of personal items, feeling the walls closing in. The reality of her situation hit her with the force of a physical blow. She was a stranger in a strange land, bound to a stranger who now stood watching her with those intense, shadowed eyes. Panic, sharp and irrational, seized her. She dropped her bag and immediately fell to her knees, bowing her head toward the floor, her body shaking with the force of her sobs. She began to stammer apologies in her native tongue, promising to work, promising to be good, promising anything to avoid the anger she was sure would come. She was trying to show him she knew her place, that she would not be a burden. The sound of her weeping echoed off the timber walls, a raw and jagged sound. She heard Julian's heavy footsteps approach, and she flinched, expecting a reprimand. Instead, she felt a large, warm hand settle gently on her shoulder. It was not a grip of possession, but a touch of grounding weight. "Stop," Julian said, his voice soft, stripping away the gravelly roughness he had used outside. He knelt down, an act that shocked her, so that he was on her level, one knee on the hard floor. He waited until she lifted her tear-stained face to look at him. His eyes were not angry. They were filled with a profound, aching recognition of her pain. "You are not a servant here, May, and you are not a prisoner." He looked around the empty, quiet room, then back at her, his expression unguarded and undeniably sad. "I know what it is to be lost," he said, the words falling like stones into deep water. "You don't have to pretend with me. Cry if you must, but do not bow." The morning light arrived not with a whisper, but with a glorious, golden crescendo, spilling over the eastern ridges and flooding the valley with a luminance that made the very air seem to hum. May woke to the sound of birdsong, a complex melody of trills and whistles that was entirely different from the birds of her homeland, yet possessing the same insistence on life. She lay still for a moment, the heavy quilt pulled up to her chin, disoriented by the smell of sage and the quality of the light hitting the raw timber of the wall. Memory returned in a rush, the wagon, the tears, the man kneeling on the floor. She sat up, her heart beating a nervous rhythm. She had slept in the only bedroom, while Julian had made a pallet for himself in the main room near the hearth. The respect of the gesture confused her as much as it relieved her. In the stories she had heard, men of the frontier took what they wanted, when they wanted. Julian's restraint felt like a puzzle she had yet to solve. She dressed quickly, smoothing the wrinkles from her tunic, and stepped out into the main room. It was empty, though the cast-iron stove was warm, and a pot of coffee sat on the back burner, filling the room with its dark, bitter aroma. Through the window she saw him. Julian was out by the barn, repairing a section of the corral fence. She watched him for a moment, hidden by the curtain. He worked with a slow, methodical rhythm, using a heavy sledge to drive a post into the earth. There was a grace to his labor, an efficiency of movement that suggested he had done this 1,000 times. He did not fight the wood or the earth. He worked with them, his body accepting the resistance as a matter of course. May felt a sudden surge of determination. She would not be a guest here. She could not bear the feeling of being a useless ornament in this hard, working world. She found a sack of flour and a tin of lard in the pantry. She did not know how to make the biscuits the Americans ate, but she knew how to make flatbread. She set to work, her hands moving instinctively, finding comfort in the familiar tactile sensation of dough yielding under her palms. When Julian entered the house an hour later, wiping sweat from his brow with his forearm, the smell of frying bread filled the air. He stopped in the doorway, surprised, his eyes moving from the table set with 2 plates to May, who stood by the stove, wiping her hands on a rag. She braced herself, waiting for him to criticize the strange food, but he simply walked to the basin, washed his hands, and sat down. He picked up a piece of the warm bread, looked at it, and then took a bite. He chewed slowly, his eyes meeting hers. "It's good," he said simply. "Thank you." The praise was small, but it felt like a door opening. They ate in silence, but it was a companionable silence, the tension of the previous night replaced by a tentative, fragile peace. By late afternoon, the sky had undergone a dramatic transformation. The benign blue of the morning had been devoured by towering cathedrals of cumulonimbus clouds, their bellies bruised, deep purple and charcoal. The air grew heavy and still, charged with static that made the hair on May's arms stand up. Julian came in from the pasture early, securing the shutters on the windows. "Storm coming," he said, his voice calm but serious. "A bad one." The light in the cabin dimmed to a twilight gloom, though it was hours before sunset. May stood near the hearth, watching the wind begin to whip the cottonwood trees into a frenzy, bending their thick trunks as if they were reeds. The first crack of thunder was not a sound, but a physical vibration that rattled the plates on the shelves and shook the floorboards beneath her feet. She gasped, instinctively stepping back from the window. In her village, storms were omens, dragons fighting in the heavens, bringing destruction. Here, on this open ocean of grass, there was no protection, no hills to break the wind's fury. The rain began to hammer against the roof, a deafening roar that drowned out all thought. A flash of lightning turned the room stark quiet, followed instantly by a crash that made May cry out and cover her ears, crouching down near the fire. She felt exposed, small, and terrified. She closed her eyes, waiting for the roof to tear away, waiting for the end. Then she felt his presence. Julian did not touch her this time, but he sat down in the chair beside where she crouched. He struck a match, the small flare of sulfur smelling sharp in the damp air, and lit the kerosene lamp on the table. The soft golden glow pushed back the shadows, creating a small circle of warmth against the raging dark. He picked up a book from the table, a leather-bound volume of poetry, surprisingly, and began to read aloud. He didn't read to the room, he read to her, though he didn't look at her. The tide rises, the tide falls, the twilight darkens, the curlew calls. His voice was a steady, rhythmic anchor in the chaos of the storm. He was building a wall of words against the fear, offering his own calm as a shelter. May lowered her hands, listening to the cadence of his deep voice. She did not understand all the words, but she understood the tone. He was telling her that the storm would pass. He was telling her that the house would hold. He was telling her that she was safe. For the first time since leaving her home, the knot of fear in her chest loosened, just a fraction, as she watched the firelight dance in the reflection of his dark eyes. The storm that had raged against the cabin walls eventually exhausted itself, leaving behind a world washed clean and trembling with new life. In the days that followed, the high summer settled over the territory with a possessive weight, the sun turning the vast prairie into a shimmering ocean of gold and green. May found her place not within the walls of the house, but in the earth just beyond the back porch. She had found a rusted spade in the barn and, with a silent, fierce determination, began to turn the soil in a patch of ground that had been surrendered to weeds. It was back-breaking work, the ground hard and resistant, riddled with stones that seemed to fight her every effort. Julian did not stop her, nor did he offer to do the work for her, understanding instinctively that she needed to claim this small square of the world as her own dominion. He would watch her sometimes from the shadow of the barn, his hat pulled low, observing the way her small frame leveraged the heavy tool, her tunic tied back, her forearms dusted with the red clay of the frontier. One evening, after returning from a supply run to the distant township, he placed a small burlap sack on the table without a word. Inside, May found seeds, squash, beans, and hardy melons, varieties that could survive the unforgiving sun. It was a gift more profound than jewelry. It was a belief in her future here. As the green shoots began to break the surface of the soil weeks later, a fragile bridge was built between them, constructed not of words, but of shared stewardship over living things. The silence that filled the house in the evenings was no longer the silence of strangers avoiding collision, but the comfortable quiet of two people moving in orbit around a shared center. The heat intensified as July burned into August, the air becoming so dry it seemed to crackle with static electricity. turning the sky a bleached, relentless white. The creek that fed the ranch began to recede, exposing stones that had not seen the sun in years, and the reality of the frontier's brutality became a daily companion. Julian announced early one morning that he needed to check the water levels at the upper spring, a ride that would take them deep into the foothills. He saddled a gentle mare for May, his movements efficient and careful as he checked the cinch. They rode out before dawn, the horse's hooves muffled by the thick dust, moving through a landscape that felt ancient and indifferent to human struggle. As they climbed higher, the air thinned and cooled slightly, carrying the scent of pine resin and dry stone. They stopped at a ridge overlooking the valley, the ranch reduced to a speck in the vastness. Julian dismounted and offered his canteen to May. As she drank, she watched him stare out at the horizon, his expression guarded, a shadow passing behind his eyes that had nothing to do with the sun. "I brought a woman here once before," he said suddenly, his voice rough, as if the words were being dragged over gravel. He didn't look at her. "Years ago, before the house was finished. The fever took her and the child in the first winter." The confession hung in the hot air, explaining the emptiness of the rooms, the ghost of a life that never happened. May lowered the canteen, her heart aching for the solitary figure standing against the sky. She understood now that his silence was not a wall to keep her out, but a fortress to keep his grief in. She stepped closer, the dry grass crunching beneath her boots, and stood beside him, offering her presence as a silent buttress against his memories. The vulnerability of that day on the ridge shifted the atmosphere between them, stripping away the last layers of formality, but the land demanded a price for every moment of peace. 2 nights later, the darkness was torn apart by the frantic, terrified bawling of the cattle in the near pasture. Julian was out of bed and into his boots before May had fully registered the sound, grabbing his rifle from the rack by the door. "Stay inside," he commanded, his voice sharp with adrenaline, before vanishing into the pitch black. But the fear that had once paralyzed May had been burned away by the summer sun. She did not stay. She lit the kerosene lantern, the glass chimney trembling in her hands, and ran out onto the porch, the night air thick with the smell of dust and animal panic. In the circle of light cast by the lantern, she saw the chaos. A pack of coyotes, emboldened by hunger, had cut a calf from the herd. The shadows were alive with teeth and eyes. She saw Julian shouting, firing a shot into the air to scatter them, but the predators were desperate. Without thinking, May grabbed a pitchfork leaning against the rail and ran toward the noise, swinging the lantern high, her voice joining Julian's in a defiant shout that surprised even her. The sudden light and the new aggressive force broke the pack's nerve. They scattered into the brush like smoke. Julian turned, chest heaving, his eyes wide as he saw her standing there, fierce and trembling, the lantern illuminating her face. In that moment, he didn't see a delicate flower from a foreign land. He saw a partner forged in the same fire as himself. The adrenaline faded slowly, leaving them both exhausted and trembling in the aftermath of the violence. They guided the spooked calf back to its mother and secured the gate, working in tandem with a fluid synchronization that required no instructions. Back inside the cabin, the light was soft and golden, a stark contrast to the wild darkness outside. Julian hung the rifle back on the wall, his hands shaking slightly, and turned to look at May. She was wiping the dust from her face with a cloth, her hair escaping its pins, her breathing still shallow. He crossed the room, the distance between them vanishing, and took the cloth from her hand. Gently, with a tenderness that belied the violence of the last hour, he wiped a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "You should have stayed inside," he murmured. But there was no reprimand in his tone, only a profound relief. "I am not a guest," May whispered, her voice steady, meeting his gaze without flinching. "I am here. This is my fight, too." Julian looked at her for a long moment, the defenses he had built over a decade crumbling. He reached out, his hand cupping the back of her neck, his thumb tracing the line of her jaw. It was the first time he had touched her with intent, and the contact sent a shock wave through the room. He pulled her into him, wrapping his arms around her, burying his face in her hair. It was not a kiss, but an embrace of desperate survival, two shipwrecked souls finally realizing they had found solid ground in each other. By late August, the garden May had planted was heavy with produce, the vines of the squash plants sprawling green and triumphant against the red earth. The evenings began to cool, carrying the first crisp promise of autumn on the wind. They sat on the porch as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in violent shades of violet and bruised orange. The silence between them now was rich and easy, filled with the comfort of known things. Julian sat whittling a replacement peg for the corral gate, while May mended a tear in his work coat, the needle flashing in the twilight. She looked out at the land that had once terrified her, at the vast, swallowing emptiness, and found it beautiful. She looked at the man beside her, his profile softened by the fading light, and felt a fierce, grounding love that had nothing to do with the romanticized stories of her youth, and everything to do with endurance, respect, and the quiet grace of being seen. Julian paused in his work, brushing the wood shavings from his trousers, and looked at her. He didn't say anything profound. He didn't need to. The way his eyes lingered on her face, warm and open, said everything. "The harvest will be good this year," he said softly. May smiled, a true, radiant smile that reached her eyes. "Yes," she replied, her hand reaching out to cover his, her fingers interlacing with his calloused ones. "It will be enough." They sat there as the stars began to puncture the canopy of the night, no longer a lone rancher and a stranger, but a family carved from the wilderness, enduring and whole.